like and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Beyond Antarctica, Chapter 22. John and Bick stood on the front deck of the ship, with the salty breeze ruffling their hair as they cast their lines into the deep blue. John suddenly felt a massive tug on his line, nearly pulling him off balance. His muscles strained as he dug his heels in. The rod bent dangerously, with its tip quivering under the immense pressure. John grunted with effort, with sweat beading on his forehead as he worked the reel, pulling in the line inch by inch. The fish beneath the surface thrashed violently, sending ripples and splashes across the water. Each time the fish pulled, John could feel the power behind it, a raw, primal force that seemed determined to break free. "Hold on, John," Bick shouted, rushing to his side. He grabbed the rod just above John's hands, adding his strength to the fight. Together, they heaved and pulled, their muscles burning from the exertion. The fish jumped out of the water, its body a shimmering blur of silver and blue. It arced through the air before crashing back down, sending a spray of water over the deck. John and Bick redoubled their efforts, their knuckles white as they gripped the rod. The reel screamed as it spun, with the line being pulled out faster than they could bring it in. "Keep it steady, Bick," John gasped, with his arms trembling with the effort. "I'm trying," Bick replied. "This thing's a beast." The fish dove deep, the line slicing through the water with a high-pitched whine. John braced himself, feet planted firmly on the deck as he fought to turn the fish's head. Slowly, they began to gain ground, the rod straightening just a bit as they pulled the fish closer to the surface. "Almost there," John panted, with his eyes fixed on the line. "Just a little more." Suddenly, the fish surged forward with a burst of speed, the line pulling taut with a sharp snap. The rod whipped back, and John stumbled, nearly losing his footing as the broken line went slack in his hands. "Damn it," John cursed, catching himself on the rail. "So close." Bick shook his head, breathing heavily. "That was one hell of a fight." Kim walked up at that moment, holding out steaming cups of coffee. "Here you two go," she said, passing the cups to John and Bick. "What are you two fishing for?" Bick chuckled, still catching his breath. "I'll let you know when we finally drag something in." John laughed. "Yeah, we'll run out of line at this rate before we actually catch anything." John took a sip and cringed. "Hey, love, this is missing something," he mumbled. Kim gave him a dirty look. "Your ribs are fine. You're not fooling anyone anymore. It's back to what Mom used to say. That's not for breakfast. See me after lunch and we'll talk," she said, turning and walking away. John waited until she was out of earshot, then pulled out a flask and splashed a dash of its contents into his coffee. He then offered the flask to Bick, who thanked him wholeheartedly. "That girl will be the death of me," John mumbled. Bick smiled. "She just cares about you, John." "Yeah, I just wish she'd care a touch less," John said with a grin, taking a sip and splashing his drink one more time. "Hey, Bob, what the hell, man? We're trying to fish over here," John called out. Bob grinned. "Yeah, how's that going for you?" John shook his head as he walked up to Bob. "At this rate, we'll never have a fresh breakfast. So what are you doing, Bob?" "Well, since we were just sitting here waiting for Todd and Tony to get back, I was trying to range these trebs and notch them so we have a clue what they can do and what ranges we can reach, and be consistent doing so." John laughed. "So you were bored and decided to play with your new toys." Bob smiled. "Yeah, I was bored, but they should be back soon." He picked up the binoculars hanging from his neck and looked out at the cultivated fields that lay in the distance. "I swear that looks like rows of corn, John, as far as one can see." John nodded. "Yeah, the map the Brother Kings gave us shows a big X on this row of islands off the coast." Bick walked up, saluting casually. "I secured the fishing gear, Captain. You want to try again tomorrow morning?" John nodded with a glint of excitement in his eyes. "You know I do. It's the only real sport we have left that I still enjoy. Same time tomorrow, Bick." As Bick walked away, John turned to Bob. "Enough playing with your toys, Bob. Put them away and meet me on the bridge." Bob kicked the deck lightly as if dusting it off with his foot. Shucks, John, I never get to have any fun. John looked over and laughed. If you want to play with your Treb some more, feel free. Bob chuckled. I'm good, John. I wanted another look at those maps anyway. I was thinking that skull in the center with the red cross might be a location, not a warning. John looked at him with amazement. Wow, now you have me wanting to take a closer look. Turning and heading off to the bridge, he motioned for Bob to follow. On the bridge, John spread out the maps on the navigation table, tracing the lines with his finger. This here, he pointed to the skull and cross. Could it really be a object instead of a warning? Bob nodded thoughtfully. It's possible. These maps are old, but the symbols are consistent with markers used to denote locations of importance, not just warnings. It's clearly over a mile off the coast, this chain of islands, John said, tracing the map with his finger. I just figured it was too dangerous for them to travel there, hence the warning. But Todd and Tony were told to be back by sunset. I guess we'll find out soon enough. These corn stalks are massive, Todd remarked, pulling off an ear of corn to examine it. The kernels were oversized, almost bursting out of their husks. I've never seen anything like this. Tony nodded. It's huge. Todd and Tony had been navigating the seemingly endless rows of corn for what felt like hours. The stalks towered above them, each one 4 times the size of any normal corn plant, creating an eerie maze. They continued to follow the rows. The cornfield seemed to stretch on forever, the only sounds being their footsteps and the rustling of the leaves. Suddenly, the corn rows came to an abrupt end at a stream. On the other side stood a large, towering house with a door at least 30 feet tall. The door was wide open, revealing a shadowy interior. Todd whispered softly, I would say this was a cottage, but its size. Tony helped Todd scramble up onto what seemed to be a porch, with the wood creaking under their combined weight. They walked cautiously inside, with their eyes widening at the sight before them. It looked like a cabin, but everything was roughly 4 times bigger than it should be. The furniture, the fireplace, even the utensils scattered on a table, all were designed for someone of immense size. This place is incredible, Tony whispered. His voice was barely audible. They wandered through the room. Suddenly, a noise from outside made them freeze. They stared at each other, with their eyes wide with fear. Over here, quick, Todd hissed, grabbing Tony's arm and pulling him behind one of the massive table legs in the center of the room. They crouched there. The creaking of the porch grew louder, accompanied by ominously loud footsteps, as if something incredibly large was making its way towards them. That's definitely something coming, Tony said, with his voice trembling. They held their breath as the noise grew closer. The floor shook slightly with each step, and the creaking grew louder and more menacing. Whatever was approaching was massive, and they were trapped in its home. The doorframe filled with a shadow, and Todd and Tony dared not move. They could see a massive foot. The air was thick with tension as the shadow moved further into the house. They could hear its heavy breathing and feel the vibrations of its footsteps. The room darkened as it entered, its sheer size blocking out the light from the open door. Todd and Tony exchanged panicked glances, knowing they had to stay hidden or risk being discovered. The giant moved deeper into the room, and they could see its enormous legs as it walked past the table. Todd could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the fear almost paralyzing him. He glanced at Tony, who looked equally terrified. The giant seemed to be searching for something, its movement slow and deliberate. It reached out and grabbed a chair, lifting it as if it weighed nothing. Todd and Tony huddled closer to the table leg, praying they wouldn't be seen. Just when they thought they couldn't bear the tension any longer, the giant moved towards the door again. It seemed to have lost interest in whatever it was looking for. The floor shook as it walked back out onto the porch, and they could hear its heavy footsteps fading away into the distance. Todd and Tony let out the breaths they had been holding, with their bodies still trembling. They remained hidden for a few more moments, just to be sure the giant was truly gone. "We need to get out of here," Tony whispered. Todd nodded. "Agreed. Let's move, but quietly." They carefully crept out from behind the table leg, making their way towards the door. The house seemed even more foreboding now, the shadows deeper and the silence more oppressive. Tony says, "We need to get back and report what we found." They slipped out of the giant's house and onto the porch with their nerves still frayed from the close encounter. The ominous sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, causing both men to freeze. They slowly turned around, realizing that whatever had left is coming back. Todd pointed back towards the house. "Let's get back inside and find a hiding spot," Todd urged. Tony agreed, and they quickly slipped back into the house. Then they began to search for a better hiding place. Todd's eyes scanned the room, settling on a large cabinet against one wall. "Over there. Let's hide inside that cabinet." They hurried over to the cabinet, with its doors towering above them. Together, they pried one open, just enough to slip inside. The interior was dark, and they had to huddle close together, but it offered much better concealment than the table leg. They could hear the faint sounds of the giant outside, the heavy footsteps drawing nearer. Every creak of the floorboard sent chills down their spines. They held their breath, listening intently as the giant re-entered the house. Todd and Tony could hear it moving around, searching for something. The floor vibrated with each movement, making their hearts pound even harder. Suddenly, the cabinet door began to creak open. Todd and Tony huddled closer. The giant's massive hand reached inside, fumbling around the shelves above them. After what felt like an eternity, it withdrew, and the cabinet door slammed shut. "That was too close," Tony whispered. Todd nodded. "We need to get out of here, but how?" They waited for the sounds of the giant to recede before carefully opening the cabinet door. The giant was still moving around the room, with its back turned to them. They had to move quickly. They made a dash for the door, but the giant turned and saw them. He stood to his full, towering height and bellowed out a blood-curdling cry that shook the very walls of the house. His eyes, filled with fury, locked onto the two tiny figures scurrying towards the exit. "Run faster!" Todd shouted, but the giant moved with shocking speed for his size. He reached over and grabbed what looked like a massive bucket, its size dwarfing the two men. The giant charged at them, each step a thunderous quake. Tony leapt for the doorframe, his fingers just brushing the wood, but it was too late. The giant swung the bucket down, trapping them inside with a deafening crash. The force of the impact sent them sprawling to the floor, and the world went dark as the bucket sealed them in. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the walls of the bucket towering around them like the sides of a prison cell. They could hear the giant's heavy breathing. The confined space amplified every sound, making their situation even more terrifying. Todd's heart raced with the darkness pressing in on all sides. "We have to find a way out of here," he shouted. Tony nodded. "But how? We're trapped." The bucket shifted slightly as the giant moved it, and they were thrown off balance, colliding with the metal walls. "We need to stay calm and think," Todd said, trying to steady his breathing. But as they looked around, the reality of their situation set in. The bucket was a perfect trap, its walls smooth. There were no cracks or gaps, no weaknesses to exploit. They were completely at the mercy of the giant. Tony banged on the walls, shouting for help, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. "This can't be how it ends," he muttered. They were trapped, and their fate was in the hands of a creature far beyond their understanding. In the pitch black, every second felt like an eternity. The weight of their predicament settled heavily on their shoulders. Todd and Tony exchanged a look, with their expressions mirroring each other's. For now, they were helpless in the dark, their world reduced to the confines of a giant's bucket. This is not goodbye, nor the end. Until the story continues, my friends, B.N.Rocker.